The mysterious crash. John was used to the quiet life. He lived alone in a small wooden cabin surrounded by tall pine trees, miles away from the nearest town. Nights in the forest were peaceful, with only the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. But that night was different. It started with a loud bang. The sound ripped through the stillness, followed by a bright streak of light cutting across the starry sky. John jumped up from his chair, nearly spilling his coffee. The crash had come from the woods, not too far from his cabin. Grabbing his flashlight and an old hunting rifle, John stepped outside. The forest was eerily silent now, as if holding its breath. The light of the moon barely reached the ground, but the faint glow from the crash site guided him. His heart pounded as he moved closer, branches crunching under his boots. After a few minutes, he found it, a small metallic pod, half buried in the soft earth. Steam hissed from its surface, and strange symbols glowed faintly along its curved edges. It was unlike anything John had ever seen. It wasn't a plane or a satellite. It was something else. Cautiously, John circled the pod, keeping his rifle ready. The hatch on the side suddenly hissed open, making him step back. A thin mist poured out, and inside, he saw a figure curled up in the shadows. His first thought was that it was a child, but as the figure moved, he realized it wasn't human. The girl had fur-covered ears that twitched nervously and a long, sleek tail wrapped around her legs. Her golden eyes glowed faintly, and her small, clawed hands trembled as she clung to the edge of the pod. She was injured. Blood, dark and thick, stained her arm and matted the fur on her side. John lowered his rifle. Whatever she was, she didn't look dangerous. She looked scared. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if she could understand him. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The girl's ears twitched at his voice, but she didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, and her golden eyes stayed locked on him, wide with fear. John took a cautious step closer. "You're hurt," he said, pointing to her arm. "I can help." She hesitated, then winced as she tried to move. Her claws scraped against the edge of the pod, but she couldn't pull herself out. John set down his rifle and reached out slowly. "Let me help," he said again. This time, she didn't resist. Gently, he lifted her out of the pod. She was lighter than he expected, her small frame shaking in his arms. Her fur was soft but cold, and her breathing was shallow. As he carried her back toward the cabin, John couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. Something about the crash site felt wrong. The glowing symbols on the pod seemed to pulse, and the air around it felt heavier. He quickened his pace, eager to get back to the safety of his home. Inside the cabin, John set the girl down on the old couch by the fireplace. She flinched as he lit the fire, but the warmth seemed to calm her. He grabbed his first aid kit and sat beside her, showing her the bandages and antiseptic. "This might sting," he said, hoping she could understand his tone, if not his words. To his surprise, she nodded. Her golden eyes stayed fixed on him as he cleaned her wound, her claws gripping the edge of the couch tightly. She didn't make a sound, even when the antiseptic made her flinch. Once her arm was bandaged, John leaned back and sighed. "Who are you?" he asked softly. "Where did you come from?" The girl tilted her head, her ears twitching. She didn't speak but raised a shaky hand and drew a symbol in the air. It was the same glowing pattern he had seen on the pod. John frowned, trying to make sense of it. "Is someone looking for you?" he asked. Her reaction was immediate. Her golden eyes widened, and she sat up suddenly, looking toward the door. Her ears flattened against her head, and a low, almost inaudible growl escaped her throat. John followed her gaze, his stomach sinking. The crash had made a lot of noise, and it wasn't just him who had noticed. In the distance, faint but distinct, came the sound of something moving through the forest. Twigs snapped, and the underbrush rustled as if something, or someone, was approaching. John grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the dark. The trees swayed gently in the wind, But beyond them, he thought he saw faint, glowing lights moving through the woods. He turned back to the girl. "Stay here," he whispered, though he doubted she'd understand. "I'll handle this." But as the sounds grew louder, he realized he might be in over his head. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't just passing through. They were coming for her. A stranger in the cabin. John closed the cabin door, bolting it firmly before glancing back at the strange girl. She was huddled on the couch, her golden eyes darting around the room, ears twitching at every small sound. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. Her tail coiled tightly around her legs, a clear sign of her anxiety. John sighed and knelt down in front of her. "You're safe here," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if she understood. Her glowing eyes studied him carefully, as if trying to judge his intentions. She didn't respond, but her tense posture relaxed just a little. Noticing her shivering, John grabbed a thick wool blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at first, but quickly pulled the blanket tight around her, her claws just barely poking out. Her small frame seemed so fragile, yet there was a sharpness in her gaze that hinted at strength and resilience. "Okay," John muttered to himself, standing up. "You need food." He rummaged through his kitchen, pulling out a loaf of bread, some canned soup, and a piece of leftover chicken. When he turned back, he saw her watching him closely, her nose twitching at the smell of the chicken. John placed the food on a plate and offered it to her. At first, she hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the plate. Then, as if hunger finally won over caution, she snatched the piece of chicken and devoured it in seconds. Her movements were quick and almost animalistic, yet there was something strangely graceful about her. John couldn't help but smile. "Guess you like that." She tilted her head, her ears perking up at the sound of his voice. Slowly, she reached out, placing a clawed finger on her chest. "Linya," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. John blinked in surprise. "Linya? Is that your name?" He pointed at her. "Linya." She nodded, her golden eyes never leaving his face. Then she pointed at him, her head tilting in question. "John," he said, tapping his chest. "My name is John." She repeated the word slowly, her accent thick and her tone melodic. "Jayon." John chuckled. "That's right. Linya and John. Nice to meet you." The moment of peace didn't last long. A sudden thud on the cabin wall made Linya's ears snap back, her body tense like a coiled spring. John grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, his heart racing. Outside, the forest was dark, but he could see faint, glowing lights moving between the trees. They weren't flashlights. They were something else, something unnatural. Linya let out a low, growling sound, her claws digging into the couch. John turned to her, his voice firm but calm. "Who's out there? Are they looking for you?" She didn't answer with words. Instead, she grabbed a piece of charcoal from the fireplace and began drawing on the floor. Her movements were quick and urgent, and when she stepped back, John saw a crude but clear image, a group of tall, armored figures with sharp weapons and glowing visors. Beside them was a smaller figure, one that looked just like Linya, bound and caged. John's stomach dropped. "They're hunting you," he said, more to himself than to her. Linya nodded, her expression filled with fear. Another thud echoed through the cabin, this time louder. John gritted his teeth, his mind racing. If these hunters were anything like the poachers he'd heard about on Earth, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And what they wanted was Linya. "All right," John said, moving quickly. "We need to prepare." He grabbed a few tools from his storage room, a hammer, nails, and some old boards. "Help me," he said, gesturing for Linya to follow. To his surprise, she jumped up and began helping him fortify the cabin. Despite her injuries, she moved with incredible speed and precision, her claws easily tearing through ropes and securing planks. It was clear she had survival instincts, but John could also see the exhaustion in her movements. As they worked, John noticed Linnea glancing nervously at the windows. Her ears twitched at every sound, and her tail swished anxiously. "Don't worry," John said, trying to reassure her. "We'll get through this." When the cabin was as secure as it could be, John handed Linnea a heavy wrench. "It's not much, but if they get in, use this to defend yourself." She took it, her grip tight and determined. The glowing lights outside grew brighter, and strange, guttural voices echoed through the forest. Linnea froze, her body trembling. John placed a hand on her shoulder. "Stay calm," he said. "We'll fight if we have to." Suddenly, a loud crash came from the front door. Something heavy was slamming against it, trying to break through. Linnea backed away, clutching the wrench tightly. John raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. The door groaned under the pressure, and John could hear the sound of claws scratching at the wood. He took a deep breath, steadying his aim. "Whatever happens," he said, glancing at Linnea, "I'll protect you." The door splintered, and the first figure stepped into the cabin. A towering, armored creature with glowing red eyes and a jagged blade in its hand. Linnea let out a sharp hiss, her claws extended. John pulled the trigger, the gunshot echoing through the cabin. The first attack. The eerie calm that followed the first shot was almost more unsettling than the chaos before it. Smoke from John's rifle drifted through the air, mixing with the acrid metallic scent left behind by the towering armored figure now lying still on the cabin floor. Its glowing red eyes flickered out, leaving only the dull glint of its jagged weapon. But there was no time to celebrate. Outside, more glowing lights approached, their movements quick and deliberate. The hunters were regrouping, and the cabin, no matter how fortified, wouldn't hold forever. John turned to Linnea. She was crouched low, her golden eyes wide with fear, but also glimmering with something else. Determination. Her claws were fully extended, sharp and deadly, as if ready to strike at any moment. She hissed softly, her tail lashing behind her like a whip. "We don't have much time," John said, grabbing more ammunition from the cabinet. "They'll be back, and they won't stop." Linnea moved to the shattered door, her ears twitching as she listened intently. Then she crouched down and began drawing in the dirt with her claw. John crouched beside her, trying to make sense of her frantic sketches. The images were crude but clear. There were 6 more hunters, each equipped with strange weapons. She drew a circular shape around the cabin, marking it with jagged lines. John frowned. "They're surrounding us." Linnea nodded, her golden eyes locking onto his. Then she added another symbol, a smaller pod, like the one she had crashed in. But this one was much larger, with long, sharp appendages jutting from its sides. She pointed toward the forest, her expression desperate. John understood immediately. "That's their ship, isn't it? If we can get to it." Linnea nodded again, but her ears flattened, and she hissed softly. John didn't need to know her language to understand. It was heavily guarded. He grabbed her shoulder gently. "Listen, we can't just wait for them to break in. If we stay here, we're sitting ducks. But if we can take out the ones guarding their ship, we might have a chance to escape." Linnea tilted her head, considering his words. Then, with a sharp nod, she stood and grabbed the wrench he had given her earlier. Her grip was firm, her movements purposeful. She was ready to fight. Before they could make a move, a loud guttural roar echoed through the forest. The lights outside began to converge on the cabin, their glow growing brighter and more menacing. John's pulse quickened as he peered through the cracks in the boarded windows. Shadows moved between the trees, their forms tall and unnaturally thin. One of them raised a strange device, and a beam of red light shot out, slicing clean through a tree trunk. The tree crashed to the ground, sending a shockwave through the earth. "Stay low," John whispered, motioning for Linnea to follow. He led her to the back of the cabin, where a small trapdoor led to a root cellar. It wasn't much, but it might give them a few moments to regroup. As they descended into the dark, cramped space, Linya suddenly grabbed John's arm, her claws digging slightly into his skin. She pointed toward a crack in the cellar wall, where faint voices could be heard. The hunters were speaking in a language John didn't understand, their words harsh and guttural. Linya's ears twitched, and she growled softly. "What are they saying?" John asked, keeping his voice low. Linya hesitated, then mined a cage with her hands, followed by a motion of being dragged. John's jaw tightened. "They want to capture you alive." She nodded, her expression grim. Then, as if to confirm her fears, the voices above grew louder, and the sound of heavy footsteps thudded across the cabin floor. The hunters were inside. John gripped his rifle tightly, his mind racing. "We can't stay here. They'll find us." Linya reached into the small pouch she had carried from her escape pod. She pulled out a small, glowing device and held it out to John. He took it carefully, studying it. It was oval-shaped, with strange markings etched into its surface. When Linya pressed a button, the device emitted a faint hum, and the air around them seemed to shimmer. "What is this?" John asked, but Linya only motioned for him to stay quiet. She pointed to the shimmer, then to the cellar's exit. John understood. "A cloaking device. This will hide us." Linya nodded, but she held up one clawed finger, signaling that the device's power was limited. They would only have a small window to act. The footsteps above grew closer, and the cellar door creaked as one of the hunters began to pry it open. Linya activated the device, and the shimmering field enveloped them just as the door was yanked aside. One of the hunters peered into the darkness, its glowing red eyes scanning the cellar. John held his breath, gripping the rifle tightly, but the hunter didn't see them. After a tense moment, it turned and left. Linya tugged at John's sleeve, motioning for him to follow. They slipped out of the cellar through a narrow tunnel that led into the forest. The cloaking device kept them hidden as they moved, but John could feel the weight of time pressing down on them. The hunters would realize they were gone soon. As they emerged into the open air, John glanced back at the cabin. The hunters were tearing it apart, their weapons reducing the structure to splinters. His home was gone, but he couldn't think about that now. Linya tugged his arm, pointing toward a faint glow in the distance. "Their ship." John nodded. "Let's end this." The bond deepens. The forest was alive with tension. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig felt like a warning. John and Linya moved quickly but carefully, keeping low as they weaved through the thick underbrush. The faint glow of the hunter's ship was visible in the distance, a menacing silhouette against the dark sky. Linya led the way, her feline instincts guiding them around the hunter's patrol routes. Her sharp ears twitched constantly, picking up sounds far beyond John's range. Occasionally, she would stop, crouch low, and listen intently before gesturing for him to follow. John was impressed by her focus and precision, even though her injuries were slowing her down. "Linya," John whispered, pausing to check their surroundings. "We've been running for hours. Are you okay?" She turned to him, her golden eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Though her face was marked with exhaustion, she gave a small nod. Then, to John's surprise, she reached out and placed her clawed hand gently on his arm, a gesture of gratitude and trust. John smiled faintly. "I'm not leaving you behind. We're in this together." Linya's ears twitched and she pointed ahead. They had reached a small clearing. In the center was a large rock formation, providing a moment of cover. The glowing lights of the hunter's ship loomed closer now, casting an eerie red hue over the forest. John crouched down behind the rocks, pulling Linya down with him. As they caught their breath, Linya pulled out a small palm-sized device from the pouch on her belt. She pressed a button, and a soft, holographic projection appeared in the air. It showed the layout of the hunter's ship, complete with highlighted routes and what appeared to be access points. John frowned, studying the projection. "You memorized their ship?" he asked, genuinely impressed. Linya nodded, pointing to a spot on the projection. "A side hatch. Then she made a series of quick gestures, tapping her head, drawing a small rectangle, and miming something falling. It took John a moment to piece it together. "You're saying we can disable their power system if we get inside?" Another nod. "Okay, but that won't be easy. The ship is crawling with those, whatever they are." Linya tilted her head, considering his words. Then she reached out, mimicking the motion of firing a weapon. Her golden eyes locked onto his rifle, then back to him. John smirked. "You want me to distract them while you sneak in?" She gave a sharp nod, her tail flicking with determination. "Fine," he said, checking his ammunition. "But if I get caught, you better come back for me." For the first time, Linya let out a soft, almost musical trill, a sound that resembled laughter. It was brief, but it warmed John's heart. Despite everything, she still had a spark of hope, a new understanding. As they prepared to move, John noticed Linya struggling with her injuries. Blood had seeped through the makeshift bandages on her arm, and her movements were slower than before. He motioned for her to stop, pulling out what little medical supplies he had left. "Hold still," he said, kneeling beside her. She flinched at first, but didn't resist as he carefully rewrapped her wounds. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, watching his every move with an intensity that made him uneasy and yet oddly comforted. Back on Earth, John began, trying to fill the silence. "People always told me I had a soft spot for strays. Guess they were right." Linya tilted her head, her ears flicking in curiosity. She didn't understand the words, but she seemed to grasp the sentiment. She reached out and placed her hand on his again, this time letting out a soft, purring sound. It wasn't just a sound of gratitude, it was a sound of connection. John chuckled. "You're full of surprises, you know that." As the moment passed, Linya gestured toward the ship again. They couldn't afford to stay hidden much longer. The hunters were moving closer, their guttural voices echoing through the forest. A glimpse of humanity. As they moved toward the ship, Linya suddenly stopped, crouching low. John followed her gaze and saw a pair of hunters patrolling nearby. Their tall, armored forms were intimidating, but their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they didn't expect resistance. Linya looked at John and mimed a circle, indicating they should flank the patrol. John nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. The plan was simple: avoid confrontation and move closer to the ship without being seen. But as they moved, one of the hunters stopped, sniffing the air. It growled something in its strange, guttural language and began moving toward their hiding spot. Linya tensed, her claws extending, ready to fight if necessary. John held up a hand, signaling her to stay still. Slowly, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small flare, a tool he had grabbed from the cabin earlier. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it into the distance. The flare ignited with a burst of red light, drawing the hunter's attention. The creatures growled and moved toward the light, giving John and Linya the opening they needed. They slipped past the patrol, their hearts pounding as they approached the ship. A growing bond. As they reached the base of the hunter's ship, Linya turned to John, her expression serious. She pointed to the access hatch, then gestured for him to stay back. "You're sure you can do this alone?" John asked, concern in his voice. Linya nodded, her golden eyes steady. Then, before slipping inside, she did something that caught John off guard. She placed her hand over his, holding it for a brief moment. It was a silent promise, a bond that needed no words. John watched as she disappeared into the ship, his rifle at the ready. The hunters would notice soon enough that their prey had slipped past them. When that happened, he would have to buy her as much time as he could. As he waited, his mind raced. He had never thought of himself as a hero, but tonight, everything had changed. Linya wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone worth fighting for. The alien technology. John crouched behind a massive tree, his rifle resting against the rough bark as he kept watch. The glowing red lights from the hunter's ship pulsed ominously in the darkness, painting the surrounding forest with an eerie hue. The soft hum of alien machinery filled the air, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. Inside the ship, Linya was on her own. The thought made John uneasy, but he trusted her instincts. She had survived this long, and her determination was something even he couldn't ignore. As he waited, the soft buzz of an alien drone caught his attention. It hovered just above the treetops, scanning the area with a rotating beam of light. John pressed himself against the tree trunk, holding his breath as the beam passed dangerously close. "Come on, Linya," he muttered under his breath. "You've got to hurry." Inside the hunter's ship, Linya slipped through the narrow access hatch, her movements silent and precise. The interior of the ship was cold and sterile, its walls lined with strange glowing panels covered in symbols she recognized but couldn't read. Her injured arm ached, but she pushed the pain aside. She had a mission, and failure wasn't an option. The ship's corridors were eerily empty, but Linya knew better than to let her guard down. The hunters were likely patrolling other parts of the forest, but a vessel this large would have automated defenses, or worse. Her ears twitched as she picked up the faint hum of machinery deeper inside. Linya's golden eyes scanned the corridor until she spotted a faint glow at the end. Moving quickly but cautiously, she reached the source of the light. It was the ship's control panel, a series of pulsating screens and holograms. She crouched low, her claws tapping lightly on the floor as she approached. Her clawed fingers danced over the controls, her memory guiding her. The hunter's technology wasn't unfamiliar to her. She had seen similar systems on her home planet before the hunters attacked. Her goal was clear: disable the ship's power core and render it useless. But as she worked, the ship's systems began to react. A low, mechanical voice filled the air, its tone cold and threatening. Linya didn't understand the language, but she didn't need to. Alarms began to blare, and the glow of the control panel shifted to an angry red. She hissed in frustration, her claws moving faster. She bypassed the security systems with a mix of precision and instinct, ignoring the alarm that echoed through the ship. Time was running out. The hunters would notice the disruption soon. Finally, the control panel emitted a sharp beep, and the lights throughout the ship dimmed. Linya felt a wave of relief as the hum of the power core faded. But her relief was short-lived. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. The hunters were returning. John's fight. Outside, John noticed the ship's glowing lights flicker and dim. He grinned, realizing Linya had succeeded. "That's my girl," he muttered. But his satisfaction didn't last long. The hunters had noticed the disruption too. Their guttural voices filled the air as they barked commands to one another. The glowing lights of their helmets turned toward the ship, and two of them began moving toward the access hatch Linya had entered. John cursed under his breath. He couldn't let them trap her inside. Gripping his rifle tightly, he took aim and fired at the nearest hunter. The shot rang out, striking the creature in the shoulder. It roared in pain, its red visor flickering, and turned to face him. "Come on, you ugly bastard," John shouted, firing again. This time, the shot hit its leg, and the hunter stumbled. Its companion turned toward the noise, drawing a strange, glowing blade that emitted a low hum. John ducked behind the tree, reloading as quickly as he could. The hunters moved with an unnatural speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. One of them swung its blade, slicing through the trunk of the tree like it was butter. John dove to the side, rolling to avoid the falling tree as it crashed to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, firing another shot. This one hit the second hunter square in the chest, knocking it back. But the creature wasn't down. It roared, its blade glowing brighter as it charged at him. Linya's escape. Inside the ship, Linya could hear the commotion outside. Her ears twitched as she picked up the sound of gunfire and the hunter's roars. She hissed softly, her tail lashing in frustration. John was buying her time, but he couldn't hold them off forever. She darted down the corridor, her claws clicking against the metal floor. Her goal was clear: escape the ship before it became her tomb. But as she reached the access hatch, she froze. A towering hunter stood in her path, its glowing red eyes fixed on her. It held a massive weapon that hummed ominously. Linya's instincts kicked in. She leaped to the side as the hunter fired, a beam of energy narrowly missing her. She used her claws to grip the wall, climbing up and launching herself toward the hunter. Her speed and agility caught it off guard, and she landed on its back, sinking her claws into the joints of its armor. The hunter roared, thrashing wildly, but Linya held on. With a fierce growl, she drove her claws deeper, severing the cables running along its spine. Sparks flew as the hunter collapsed, its weapon clattering to the floor. Breathing heavily, Linya pushed open the access hatch and slipped outside. She scanned the area, her eyes locking onto John, who was struggling to hold off two hunters. Without hesitation, she darted toward him. The turning point. John was running out of ammo, and the hunters were closing in. Just as one of them raised its blade for a final strike, Linya appeared out of nowhere. She leaped onto the hunter's back, her claws tearing into its exposed neck. The creature let out a guttural cry before collapsing. The second hunter turned to face her, but John didn't waste the opportunity. He fired his last shot, hitting the creature in the head. Its glowing visor shattered, and it fell to the ground with a heavy thud. John leaned against a tree, breathing hard. "You took your time," he said, grinning at Linya. Linya tilted her head, letting out a soft trill that sounded like a laugh. She gestured toward the now dim ship, then back to John, her expression serious. The fight wasn't over yet. The final stand. The forest was eerily quiet after the battle near the ship. Smoke from the collapsed hunters drifted into the night sky, and the distant hum of the damaged vessel was now faint, like a wounded beast licking its wounds. But both John and Linya knew the fight was far from over. John wiped sweat from his brow, his hands trembling as he reloaded his rifle with the few rounds he had left. Linya stood nearby, her tail swishing in agitation as she scanned the tree line, her ears twitching at every faint sound. The bond between them had deepened during their ordeal, but now it was being tested to its limits. "They'll be back soon," John said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. "If they called for reinforcements, we're in real trouble." Linya nodded, her golden eyes narrowing. She tapped her claws on the ground, mimicking the sound of marching feet, then pointed toward the glowing horizon. The hunters weren't retreating. They were regrouping. John clenched his jaw. "Then we make our stand here. No running." Linya tilted her head, her expression serious. She crouched down and began drawing in the dirt again, sketching a crude map of their surroundings. She pointed to the remnants of the hunter's ship, then to a nearby rocky outcrop. "You're saying we can use the terrain to trap them?" John asked, studying her plan. She nodded, her tail flicking with determination. John grinned despite himself. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Setting the trap. They worked quickly, using whatever resources they could find in the forest. Linya's claws proved invaluable for cutting through thick vines, while John used his knowledge of hunting to rig traps and create bottlenecks. The rocky outcrop Linya had pointed to provided natural cover, and John positioned himself there with a clear line of sight. Linya, meanwhile, disappeared into the shadows, her movements silent as she scouted the area. When she returned, her expression was grim. She held up 3 fingers, then mined a large hulking figure. John's stomach sank. "More of those armored brutes?" he asked. Linya nodded, then pointed to the ship, miming a smaller but faster figure. John frowned. "And drones. Great. They're throwing everything at us." Linya let out a soft growl, her claws flexing. She mimed tearing something apart, her golden eyes fierce. She wasn't planning to let them win. The first wave. The first hunter emerged from the shadows, its glowing red visor cutting through the darkness. John steadied his rifle, exhaling slowly as he lined up the shot. He waited until the creature stepped into the trap. A vine stretched tightly across the path. When its foot hit the vine, a makeshift net of sharp stones and spikes dropped from above, tangling the hunter and pinning it to the ground. John fired, the shot hitting the exposed joint of its armor. The hunter roared, thrashing wildly, but Linya was already on it. She darted from the shadows, her claws tearing through the cables in its neck. Sparks flew as the hunter collapsed, its visor flickering before going dark. One down. The second and third hunters were smarter, moving cautiously as they approached. They scanned the area with their glowing visors, their guttural voices communicating in a language John couldn't understand. One of them carried a massive glowing blade, while the other held a strange, cannon-like weapon. Linya motioned for John to stay low as she crept toward the second hunter. But as she moved, the third hunter's cannon fired, sending a pulse of energy ripping through the trees. The blast knocked Linya off her feet, and she let out a sharp cry as she hit the ground. "Linya!" John shouted, firing at the cannon-wielding hunter. His bullet hit its shoulder, but the creature barely flinched. It turned its glowing red eyes on him, raising its weapon for another shot. Before it could fire, Linya recovered, leaping onto its back. Her claws sank into the joints of its armor, and she twisted hard, severing critical cables. The hunter roared, dropping its weapon as it collapsed. But the final hunter, armed with the massive blade, charged at Linya. John's heart raced as he scrambled to reload. "Get down," he shouted. Linya rolled out of the way just as the blade sliced through the ground where she had been. John fired, the shot hitting the hunter in its exposed knee. It stumbled, and Linya took advantage, driving her claws into its neck. The hunter fell, its blade sinking into the dirt. Linya stood over it, breathing heavily, her fur matted with sweat and dirt. She turned to John and gave a small nod. The second wave was down. The final showdown. As they caught their breath, a deep mechanical growl filled the air. The ground trembled as the leader of the hunters emerged from the damaged ship. It was massive, easily twice the size of the others, with reinforced armor that glowed faintly with energy. Its weapon was unlike anything they had seen before, a long staff that crackled with electricity. John's hands tightened around his rifle. "Of course, there's a boss fight," he muttered. Linya growled softly, her claws flexing. She crouched low, her tail swishing in anticipation. Together, they faced the towering figure. The leader moved with surprising speed, swinging its staff in a wide arc. The electricity crackled as it struck the ground, sending a shockwave rippling through the air. John and Linya dove in opposite directions, narrowly avoiding the blast. John fired, but his bullets barely scratched the creature's armor. Linya darted in, slashing at its joints, but the reinforced plating deflected her claws. The creature retaliated, its staff grazing her side and sending sparks flying. Desperation set in as John searched for a weak point. His eyes landed on the glowing core at the center of the leader's chest. "Linya," he shouted, pointing to the core. "Go for the center." Linya nodded, her golden eyes narrowing. She leaped onto the creature's back, her claws finding purchase in its armor. The leader roared, trying to shake her off, but she held on, clawing her way toward the core. John fired at the core, the impact causing the glow to flicker. Linya seized the opportunity, driving her claws into the exposed circuitry. With a final, primal roar, the leader collapsed, sparks flying as its core dimmed. Aftermath. The forest fell silent once more. Linya collapsed to her knees, exhausted but alive. John rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. Linya let out a soft trill, her purring a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. The bond between them had been forged in fire, and it was unbreakable. But as they looked toward the horizon, the faint glow of another ship appeared in the distance. A new family. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the forest in hues of orange and gold. Smoke curled lazily from the wreckage of the hunter's ship, now silent and still. The eerie hum that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by the soothing sounds of the waking forest. John leaned against a tree, exhausted but alive. His rifle hung loosely in his hands, the barrel still warm from the last shot. Beside him, Linya sat on the ground, her tail curled tightly around her legs. She was covered in scratches and bruises, her golden eyes dulled with fatigue. But she was alive. Her soft purring filled the air, a sound that made John smile despite the chaos they had just endured. "You did good out there," John said, his voice hoarse. I didn't think we'd actually pull it off, but here we are." Linya tilted her head, her ears twitching at his tone. Though she didn't understand his words, she seemed to grasp his meaning. She let out a soft trill, her version of a laugh, and nudged him gently with her shoulder. For a moment, the world felt peaceful, but that peace was shattered when Linya's ears perked up, her body tensing. She sniffed the air, her golden eyes narrowing as she looked toward the horizon. John followed her gaze and felt his heart sink. A faint, glowing light was visible in the distance, the unmistakable sign of another ship. "Reinforcements," John muttered, tightening his grip on his rifle. "Of course, they sent backup." Linya growled softly, but instead of fear, there was a spark of determination in her eyes. She stood, her claws flexing as she prepared for another fight. But then she winced, her hand going to her side where a fresh wound bled through her fur. "No," John said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're in no shape to fight. We need a plan." The revelation. As they debated their next move, Linya suddenly staggered, clutching her stomach. Her breathing grew labored, and her golden eyes filled with pain. John rushed to her side, panic rising in his chest. "What's wrong?" he asked, though he knew she couldn't answer. He knelt beside her, unsure of what to do. Linya let out a soft, trembling trill, her claws digging into the ground. Then it hit him. Her species, her rapid healing, the signs she had been showing. Linya wasn't just injured, she was going into labor. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," John muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Now, of all times." Linya growled softly, her body trembling as she lay down on the forest floor. John realized they had no choice. They couldn't keep running, and they couldn't fight. Not with Linya in this state. "We're staying here," John said, his voice resolute. He looked around, spotting a small, hidden hollow beneath a fallen tree. It wasn't much, but it would provide some cover. He helped Linya to her feet, guiding her to the hollow. She collapsed onto the soft earth, her breaths shallow but steady. The birth. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The glowing lights of the approaching ship grew brighter, but John pushed the thought to the back of his mind. His focus was entirely on Linya, who lay curled in the hollow, her body trembling with effort. John stayed by her side, offering what little comfort he could. He had no idea how her species gave birth, but he figured the basics couldn't be too different. He spoke to her softly, his words meant more to calm himself than her. "You're doing great," he said. "Just hang in there." Linya let out a low trill, her golden eyes locking onto his. Despite her pain, there was trust in her gaze. She knew she wasn't alone. Finally, the moment came. Linya let out a sharp cry, her claws digging into the earth. Then, one by one, tiny forms emerged. John stared in awe as Linya gave birth to 3 small, fur-covered kittens. They were perfect blends of their mother's alien features and something entirely new. Tiny beings with soft fur, twitching tails, and faintly glowing eyes. "They're beautiful," John whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Linya purred softly, nuzzling her newborns. The kittens let out tiny, squeaky trills, their small paws batting at the air. John couldn't help but smile as he watched them, a warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The new threat. But the moment of peace didn't last. The faint hum of the approaching ship grew louder, and the glowing lights in the distance began to take shape. John stood, his rifle in hand, As he scanned the horizon, he could see the sleek, angular design of the hunters' reinforcements. They were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they finished the job. John turned to Linya, who was grooming her kittens, her ears twitching at the sound of the ship. She looked up at him, her golden eyes filled with worry. "We have to protect them," John said, his voice firm. He looked around, his mind racing. The hollow offered some cover, but it wouldn't hold against a full assault. He needed to buy them time. Linya growled softly, her claws flexing as she tried to stand. But John placed a hand on her shoulder, shaking his head. "You stay here. Keep them safe. I'll handle this." Linya hissed in protest, but John met her gaze with unwavering resolve. "You trust me, don't you?" After a moment, Linya nodded, her ears flattening as she settled back down. She curled protectively around her kittens, her purring growing louder as if to soothe them. A father's resolve. John moved to the edge of the hollow, his rifle ready. He knew the odds were against him. He was just one man with a gun, facing advanced alien hunters. But he didn't care. He had something worth fighting for now, something worth dying for if it came to that. As the hunter's ship descended, its engines kicking up dirt and debris, John took a deep breath. He could see the shadowy figures disembarking, their glowing visors scanning the area. They moved with precision, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. John raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Come on," he muttered. "Let's finish this." But just as the hunters began their advance, a new sound filled the air, a low, rumbling growl. John froze, his eyes widening as massive, feline-like shapes emerged from the forest. They were Linya's kind, others who had survived the hunter's wrath. They had come, drawn by Linya's cries and the scent of her newborns. The hunters hesitated, their formation breaking as the feline creatures charged. John watched in awe as the tables turned, the hunters overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of Linya's people. Linya appeared at his side, her kittens nestled safely in a makeshift sling she had fashioned. She looked at John, her golden eyes shining with gratitude and determination. Together, they watched as the hunters were driven back, their ship retreating into the sky. For the first time, John felt hope, not just for Linya and her kittens, but for the bond between their worlds.